So I've mentioned pure functions a few times. What is a pure function? So this comes out of the world of functional programming. And there's a book, I think it's called Grokking Simplicity. I haven't read it. It's on my list, but I know several people who have, and I've listened to the author talk. And it really drives home this point. A pure function is a function that's deterministic. So the output only depends on the current input. So these are like calculations usually. So you might have 3 or 4 numeric inputs. You run them in through some numeric calculation and you get an output. You have an array and you're filtering it for certain elements and you output a new array that only contains those elements that pass the filter. Or you've got several clusters and you're putting them together in some way and coming up with some new data structures. You're taking some structured data and you're changing the structure of it to pull out some things that you want. All of those functions, the output only depends on the current input. And so that makes it really easy to test because in our test, we can control the input by dropping a bunch of constants. And we can verify the output easily by looking at the what comes out through the connector pane. And we have everything that we need to do our test. In contrast, we have something called side effects. Side effects are things that are non-deterministic. So your output depends on some external state, or the output is some action, or maybe the input comes from some external state. So as an example, maybe you have some code that reads something from a web service and does some calculation to the data. Or maybe you have something that, depending on what time of day you run it, does different things. Or you have something that talks to a piece of hardware and pulls some data off of that. All of that is a side effect. They're all non-deterministic things. So a good general rule of thumb if we want to write testable code is to make sure that as many of our functions, when you hear functions, think sub-VI, are as pure as possible. Right? So we want sub-VIs that have inputs and outputs and don't depend on anything else. Don't depend on web services, databases, a piece of hardware, a serial connection, any kind of network traffic, anything like that. And also time too. So we want things that don't depend on what time of day you run them. And a thing to keep in mind is if you have a function or a sub-VI and it calls a sub-VI that is itself not pure, right? It has some side effect, then the calling function also has a side effect. So we want to separate as much as possible the code that is just logic, that is just a calculation, from the code that interacts with the GUI is another one that I didn't mention earlier that makes something have side effects, right? If it depends on what the state of an input is on the GUI, right? Or it depends on the user pressing a button. That's also non-deterministic. And the biggest bang for your buck in terms of writing testable code and taking existing code and making it testable is separating those things out. Because again, when we have a pure function that's just logic, it's really easy to test.